keep it simple. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Graham. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. This is the Crazy in Love podcast. We're two relationship counselors, couples counselors, looking at all the ways in which we go a little bit crazy in the world of relationships. And one of those areas is sex and the importance of sex in relationships. The kind of classic idea is that you start off a relationship with loads and loads of sex, and then over time you have a little bit less and less and less, to the point where you're barely having it at all. But we're going to unpick a bit of that today and just ask, is that true? And how important is regular sex over the course of a relationship? Where do you start on all this, Matt?
I think the blog that you predominantly wrote recently on sex and relationships, I thought was a really good start point. I really liked the title, Just Do It. And I was going to ask you about that headline and that sentiment. I suppose that's where I start on it, that there is a real importance in keeping that connection going. But is that the headline? Is that just a sort of clickbaity thing, or is that your stance on it, that it really is important in a relationship?
I think it's really important in a relationship, but I think it was almost deliberately provocative, that headline, in the sense that there's understandably an idea that no one should ever have sex when they don't want to in a relationship. But what the blog post was trying to get to was this idea that we can see our sex lives as one aspect of a relationship where both parties their needs need to be considered. So in the same way that you need to make sure you're communicating well in a relationship, in the same way that you need to make sure that your partner's emotional needs are met, I think it's important to always have in mind that we should be trying to meet our partner's physical needs as well. And the idea around just do it is occasionally you might need to, even if the motivation's not there, even if you're just not feeling it, you've got one mind on tomorrow morning's work meeting, and instead of actively wanting to have sex, chances are you're probably going to enjoy it anyway if you get started. And even if you don't enjoy it that much, that one time that your partner reaches out to you on the Thursday evening, it's all right. It's all right not to have amazing sex every time that you're getting in the bedroom together.
Yeah, and it's okay to say, like, you're really not in the mood for it. But we're not. The advice is not to be doing that too often. To just check yourself if that's constantly the default, right? Because I guess that's what you and I think leads to sexless relationships. So we talk about this, don't we, separately quite often, like how many couples exist in that state. So they're together, they're married, they're not really even thinking of ending the relationship, but often they've been without sex for quite some time, not just a month or two, quite often, sometimes even a year or two, which feels, it feels hard to imagine. It feels a sort of a sad thing to imagine, and it's almost never what they want or what they expected.
Yes, and rarely talked about, I think, outside of the relationship. The statistics surveys seem to suggest that about 15% or so of couples haven't had sex for a year.
Yeah.
And I think it's only a slightly smaller percentage that haven't had sex for 5 years or more. So there's a large number of couples out there that have had half a decade or more of not having any sex whatsoever. And it's hard to believe, isn't it, that the vast majority of those couples are happy with that outcome.
Yeah, and I think in the article you talk about some instances where maybe people have come to that accommodation, that maybe something particular about their lives, but I didn't necessarily want to get stuck on that. I think all we're saying is that for most people, most of the time, it really does matter, unless you made a very conscious decision or sex is problematic in some way, shape, or form for you. Actually, it's a very ordinary appetite. If there's no physical problem, no medical impediment, it's usually, we consider it one of life's pleasures, and it's a shame to miss out on it. And that tends to be how most couples view it when they come to us and they complain about that part of their lives having gone missing.
Yeah, I think part of the blog post, part of the purpose of the blog post is to just say to couples in that situations, are you sure how your partner's feeling about it? Like, question how you're feeling about it. Have the conversation with your partner if you can. At least show curiosity and interest in how your partner feels about it, because the couples with this issue around sexlessness in a relationship that I see in couples work, it tends to be at least one of the partners has been breeding resentment about that lack of sex in the relationship for months, if not years. It tells a story about how they feel more generally in the relationship. It's not just a kind of add-on extra. It tends to kind of connect with feeling attractive, valued, thought about, desired in the relationship more generally.
Yeah, I was going to add a couple of things just quickly. It's not older couples as well when I see
Yeah.
them. It's really across that spectrum of ages. So I see some couples who are in there probably more towards their late 20s than early 20s, honestly, plenty in their 30s and probably more in their 40s. But in the 20s and 30s, it comes up as well. It's usually not like 5 years because perhaps the relationship hasn't been that long, but the first flush of sexual excitement is gone and it now feels a bit manufactured, or it feels like something that's kind of a bit of a nuisance, or it's become difficult, or it's just drifted.
Yeah. Often because of life circumstances, often because of things like career goals, career, just working long hours, potentially young children involved, things like that.
Yeah, I think so. I was going to ask you about that. I wonder what you put it down to. I think children are. Ian Kellner, who's a couples therapist who's written quite well in this area, talks about babies being a disaster for the relationship.
Yeah.
So it's going to unite us, but actually, if you look at the divorce stats, they spike in years 0 to 3. It's a really tough time, isn't it? Your sleep is interrupted. Often like sleeping arrangements themselves are interrupted. People are on a different kind of time frame. I think that's a very obvious one, and then sometimes that sets a pattern. Is that how you'd see it? What would you add to that in terms of the reasons people
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the more kind of contextual load of factors that I think are really important around kind of where are you in life, around if children are there. I think there's all sorts of contextual factors around having children sleeping in different beds, potentially, all the attention going on the child, even the kind of more psychological aspects of your roles changing. So instead of your role being you're a partner in the relationship, you consider yourself parent first and foremost, and that just getting in the way. Where it's more kind of younger couples without any of those things necessarily going on, I sometimes do think it's about what happens when quite deep emotional feelings start to emerge in the relationship, and how actually those early flushes of kind of lust give way to some more complex attachment type factors, and people struggling to combine love and sex in a relationship. So sex early on is quite exciting, quite dynamic, but as soon as they start to genuinely fall in love with someone, that becoming harder and harder to hold both versions of their partner in mind, and find that partner attractive, the same partner that they have vulnerability with, that they're intimate with, in emotionally, finding it quite difficult to find that person sexually attractive as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I'd maybe bracket that off, and we might come back to that because I think there's something more to explore there, isn't there? The complexity that you're talking about in that instance. I was on the more sort of prosaic, everyday stuff. When the kids are around, when the kids are a bit older, they're always around, aren't they, as well? I think that gets in the way. I think couples are uncomfortable about that. And then I think the allied thing is you probably need to schedule it. You probably need to agree that there's a window when they're in bed before you're too exhausted, just after dinner or just before, or there's a gap in the morning or something like that. And couples I talk to are really allergic to anything like that, which is pre-planned or specified or, put in a calendar.
Weird idea that sex should exist as this one thing in the world that shouldn't be diarized, shouldn't be scheduled. Yeah, sure. No, I know what we're talking about, and so much of our conversations end up with me with this feeling we've talked about. Like so much of these conversations lead to a deeply unromantic place of the solution is you've got to schedule sex for Monday at 8 o'clock at night. How you're feeling, but I think our point in the blog post is even if you have to do that, chances are you're going to have fun, right?
Yeah, and you're going to end up in a better place, aren't you? I think you're absolutely right. You're going to have fun, and it puts something of a spring in your step. You feel better about the world. That is a more romantic, more pleasant feeling, then another week's rolled by, right? So I don't think it is terribly romantic to, stick it in a calendar, but like, what's the alternative? In our perfect world, I don't know, where we're always in bed on Saturday morning and like life is easy breezy and there are no stresses and strains, but that's not the comparison point for most people. It's like, do you grab that window of opportunity or don't you? And so I think sometimes I am being quite practical, not really directive, because I mean, it's up to them, right? But like, if you're going to do it in a busy life and a busy relationship and a busy family, you probably do need to think practically about it in the way that you might. When are you going to the gym? When are you seeing your friends? Those kind of things. Just they don't in busy lives. They don't just happen. You don't just bump into people anymore. You've got to schedule something, right?
Yeah. That so much of that is about motivation, isn't it? Don't wait for the motivation, do it, and the motivation to some degree will come. That getting up at 5 a.m. to go to the gym isn't fun necessarily, but once you're there and once you're doing it, you genuinely can enjoy aspects of it. It's not all grind. It's you enjoy lifting the weights in the same way that you might not want to schedule sex in at a certain time, but you probably are going to end up finding the motivation somewhere along the way. Part of the problem, though, is where couples genuinely struggle to find each other sexually attractive, right? And that it's easy to some degree to say to them, well, see if you do along the way. And a lot of couples, in my experience, do that. They once they do start having more regular scheduled sex, tend to genuinely find each other a bit more sexually attractive than they used to. But there are certain couples, aren't there, that just genuinely, over time, bodies change, lives change, they find each other less and less attractive.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's exactly right. I think that's part of the reason for experimenting with practical things like putting it in the calendar, because if that works, then you've solved the problem. If it doesn't work, you've maybe got something a bit deeper to come back to. The French have that saying that your appetite arrives when the food arrives. It's something like that. It's like, will it arrive? Can you still get back into the moment? Can you remember what you liked about that person? Can you have fun? Can sex at 30 feel different to how it felt in your early 20s, or in your 40s with children and a family together? It probably is going to feel different, but could it still feel lovely? Could it still feel agreeable, enjoyable, like a real genuine pleasure? And if not, you're probably into different territory, aren't you? Probably, that's a different kind of question. Something about our bodies aging, something about the way that women feel often about the birth of their first child, something about that kind of period of absence that gets in the way as well. You talk a little bit about that in the article.
What do you mean by absence?
So in that sort of first phase where all of the focus is on the infant, and often we're in different beds, and schedules are different, with one person perhaps staying at home, the other back at work, in that kind of traditional setup that it goes. There's usually a sort of period of months where no one's even thinking that thought, and then all of a sudden we've stopped the habit. We feel a bit different about our body. We're feeling quite tired anyhow.
Yeah, it's interesting when you said, but both people aren't thinking about it. I think often the man is thinking about it, but it's not spoken about. I think it's, and partly because, contrary to a lot of kind of classic ideas, that in the period of pregnancy, couples often have a lot of sex. The libido tends to go up for both, particularly the woman. Quite enjoy those body changes. Then when the body goes back to normal, and the woman is kind of doing the majority of the caretaking and feels quite differently about her body and isn't necessarily even thinking about having sex, that the man can again breed a bit of resentment. They're not getting any attention in the relationship, and they're also not getting any sex to compensate for that. So they tend to silently seethe in those kind of situations, which again is quite toxic for the relationship. So much of that is about talking about it up front, is about anticipating it, and finding your way back together after a period of time, and a degree of acceptance that it's going to be like that, I think, in those months.
Yeah, I was going to say a minute or two back, when we were talking about it not just affecting older couples or couples in a later phase of the relationship, that it can affect younger couples who've been together for a bit too. It sort of strikes me what you're talking about there is maybe men and women having a different take on it. What I've been surprised by I guess, is how many women are looking for sex and are unhappy
Yeah.
about sex and are bringing that as the principal complaint, and how many guys. I think I would have thought, sort of, before doing this kind of work, it was the guy going after it. I think just the sort
Right.
of the old-fashioned notion that men
Yeah.
want sex than women really hasn't been my experience
Yeah.
at all. And a lot of guys, because there's something to be achieved, there's an erection to be gotten and maintained, that bit becomes difficult. This performance anxiety creeps in, and it becomes a sort of, it's a psychological thing that becomes a physical thing, and then those two things get bound up together. So I was just going to observe that I've been surprised at how many women are bringing that as the
Yeah.
complaint, and how many men are sort of finding that bit really awkward, difficult, uncomfortable to talk about, but not necessarily pushing the case for more sex.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting.
Find that too, or less so?
Um, Similarly, I do think it's a remnant of just old-fashioned ideas about sexuality and sexual desire. Um, I don't have a huge amount to add to what you were just saying. Just that even in that kind of post-pregnancy stage that we were talking about a few moments ago, I don't think it's necessarily an absence of desire on the woman's part, an absence of wanting sex. It can just often be a sense of, my body's not ready for that at the moment. I'm not sure that physically I'm in that place to want to do it. So I don't,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a kind of absence of desire for sure. I think
Okay.
this kind of potentially segues into kind of conversations about frequency, conversations about type of sex, this kind of this old fashioned idea that sex as you stay together for longer needs to get more dramatic, you need to push the envelope a little bit, spice things up. Like what's your view on that kind of that element of couple sex lives?
I'm really skeptical. I work with quite a few couples who've gone to somebody who specifically calls himself a sex therapist. I'm never quite sure, honestly, what that means, but they'll be given activities or exercises, things to sort of put them in touch with, like, sensations and
Yeah.
all sorts of sometimes quite creative activities. But it never seems to me to be the problem. That's not quite what's going on. It's more shyness around the body, or falling out of habit, or worries about performance issues. And I feel
Interesting.
like on some of those things it's just a more obvious psychological route, as well as some behavioral and habit change that will probably more likely unlocks it.
Interesting. So less about lack of desire and potentially more about other things around the edges.
Yeah, I think it's just like a lot of things. When you do it, it can be quite enjoyable, and the thought of it is sometimes a bit off-putting, isn't it? I love catching up with my friends, but we always do that in central London. I always find going into central London, even though I'm in zone 3, so it's a bit sort of pathetic complaint, I find it a bit of a schlep. My son and I love watching Tottenham play home games, but I always find it a bit of a schlep to get down there. Love it when I'm there. I think it's one of those sorts of things that you push yourself. You do that. The line I liked in the piece that you wrote was something like, if you go along to a family occasion, if you see your in-laws not necessarily relishing it, I'm not sure whether that was the example you gave, but
Yeah, yeah.
with that example, if you do that for your partner, if you put themselves out for your partner, why wouldn't you do something that's got an even more obvious payback for you, like sex?
Yeah, I think some of the examples we used in retrospect don't quite fit what I was trying to say, in the sense that they sound like slightly arduous things potentially to have to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the point was, there's always going to be things in a relationship that you want to offer your partner,
Yeah.
and sex sometimes, even if you're not 100% in the mood to begin with, is one of them. But
Yeah.
again, chances are it's going to be quite fun.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Maybe this is our sort of our kind of final segment. It's often difficult for couples to talk about this, right? Because rather than saying, I miss us having sex together, I miss having sex with you, I really loved that, I'd like us to get back there, it ends up kind of coming out as we never have sex anymore, or you can't be bothered, or you're always at work, or And we're sensitive about it, aren't we? I know the guys I talk to are sensitive about it, but I think pretty much everyone is a bit sensitive about sex, and whether they're, when there's an accusation against them, like in any area of life, we often defend ourselves, don't we? We hit back, never more so than when it's about sex. That kind of plain statement that I liked it, it was a pleasure for me, I miss it, I miss you, seems hard for couples to state it that way. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly difficult for couples to talk about. It can feel demanding to ask for it, particularly in those times we've been talking about, kind of post-pregnancy, post-birth. I think it's like you're inserting yourself into a dynamic that feels wrong to do it, that you should just shut up and go through your year of sexlessness, really.
Yeah.
In that situation, I don't think we've got any easy solutions other than to try and own it and to open up that space to talk about it. And I think the crucial point is, if there is a change in dynamic and one that affects you in a negative way, and that has the potential to bleed into something like more deeper resentment, that you're catching that early and not just going along for the ride, not just allowing that to happen. That it is important, it's likely to remain important well into your 70s, 80s, 90s, again, regardless of what people tell you. If you don't address it now, it is likely to become a bigger problem further down the line for you. That doesn't mean you need to be having it 10 times a week. Just the occasional kind of sex, I think for most couples is enough. Like, it doesn't need to be too regular, but it just needs to be regular enough that you don't feel like you're being completely missed in the relationship, and completely that's drying up.
I was just thinking, maybe my final comment, I was just thinking about what I say to couples more generally, sometimes individuals as well, who I see. It's okay to, when we're talking about relationships, it's okay to ask for what you want. And that doesn't mean you'll get it, right? But it is okay to ask for what you want. And I see it's a sort of, it can feel a bit light, it can feel a bit simple, but I think that construction that you would ask your partner for something that you want is sometimes quite a helpful way through. If you like that thing, if you miss that thing, if you want something, you could just state it. And I suppose that's where all of this starts, really, isn't it? If we are going to solve this problem, one person has got to say what they want to the other. They've got to be then listened to and responded to, and the other person gets a right of reply. They don't have to agree, but that sort of construction is one way through it. And the absence of that, I think it just leaves us mind reading, or hoping for the best, or assuming it will change when the child gets to school, or gets through the terrible twos, or starts sleeping through the night, or whatever. And that is seldom the case, that these things fix themselves, right?
That was the only thing I was going to add to your point before we finish up, was that yes, you can ask, but sometimes that ask, and I'd encourage that, but sometimes the asking gets met with a no, but you just need to understand that we're going through this period of our relationship. And once that period of the relationship is over, we'll get back to normality. And I agree with you strongly. Rarely is that the case. If you're in a pattern, unless it's a very short-term pattern of a specific kind of week or month of heavy work, or a very young child, something like that, chances are you're going to have to take some action to address a decrease in sex, rather than just wait for it to get better.
And I guess to come full circle to the title of the piece, Just Do It, there is something that is an imperative on everybody to give that, to receive that, to be in the market for it, is a component part of relationships, it seems, right?
Yeah, I think just taking it way back, the whole Scott, I was listening to Scott Galloway talk the other day, and his main point is the sexual drive is what brings people together. People don't fall in love without sex. They end up wanting to sleep with each other. They sleep with each other, and then that leads to love and connection and intimacy. Like, it's an important part and a fun part of a relationship. Like, if it's easing out of the relationship, question it, do something about it, because you're missing something that's, for the vast majority of people, really important to their happiness and their sense of emotional satisfaction in their relationship.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice place to leave it, isn't it? He placed a very big bet on Kamala Harris to win the election.
He did, but he's also an investor in Bitcoin, isn't he? So he's probably made quite a ton of money as well.
I don't think we need to lose too much sleep worrying about his
I don't think we do.
financial position. Yeah. All right. Great. Really nice to see you.
Good to see you. Take care of yourself.
Cheers. You too.
See you soon. Bye.